The form said, "Welfare check. Routine." Tonks had underlined "routine" twice with the end of her quill, and then she had put the quill down because she was fairly sure underlining things twice didn't make them more true. It was 7:30 in the morning. The Auror office was empty, except for her and the filing cabinet she had walked into on her way to her desk, which had left a bruise in the shape of a drawer handle on her left hip, and which had definitely not made a noise loud enough to carry to the corridor. She had righted the stack of parchment the collision dislodged. She had checked whether anyone had heard. There was no one to hear. That was fine. That was, in fact, ideal. She was the most junior Auror in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. She had qualified 3 weeks ago, which, she had been reminded twice before breakfast, made her the newest addition to a team of people with significantly more experience, more scars, and more interesting filing cabinets. The senior Auror 2 desks over had a filing cabinet with a lock on it and a faint, irregular hum, and she had decided during training that she would not ask about it. Not yet. One thing at a time. Her hair was bubblegum pink. She considered changing it to something more professionally appropriate. Brown, perhaps, or even a restrained auburn. And then she thought. No, actually, and left it exactly where it was. The assignment had come at 6:45, right on the threshold between early and obscene. Her senior training officer had handed her the file without ceremony, which was his customary approach to most things. "Welfare check," he'd said. "Harry Potter. 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey." The tone was one she had learned to recognize. This is the sort of thing we give the new ones because nothing will happen. Post-Sirius Black escape, the Ministry had a cursory obligation to confirm the boy's home situation was still secure. She had the standard welfare forms. The forms asked very specific, very sensible questions. She was to ask the questions, note the answers, and return to the office by midday. The context, as she understood it from the briefing, Sirius Black had escaped Azkaban the previous June, the only person ever to do so, according to official record, though the precise method remained classified even to junior Aurors. He was Harry Potter's godfather. He was also, as far as the Ministry was concerned, a convicted murderer still at large. These facts existed simultaneously, and the Ministry found this arrangement somewhat uncomfortable, which had produced, among other things, the welfare check she was currently holding. She opened the file. The photograph inside was from the Prophet. She could tell from the way the subject moved in it, that slightly self-conscious quality of a person who has been informed a camera is present. He was small, dark hair that appeared to have reached some fundamental disagreement with gravity and given up on the matter entirely. Round glasses, a scar on his forehead in the shape of a lightning bolt, which she knew the story of because everyone in Britain with any connection to the wizarding world knew the story of, because it was not really a scar so much as it was something that had been written on a child without his consent and then turned into a headline. Harry James Potter, 13 years old, the boy who lived it. She had expected to feel something like reverence looking at that photograph. What she actually felt was a quiet, purposeless irritation that had nothing to do with him. He looked exactly as famous as he had no choice but to look. She closed the file and tucked it under her arm. The Ministry atrium was quiet at this hour. She walked through it with the slightly deliberate gait of someone who was absolutely not going to trip over anything, and was not thinking about it even a little. She made it through the lifts, out the visitor entrance, and into the thick London morning without incident. She counted that as a win and wrote it nowhere. She apparated to a park on the outskirts of Little Whinging and walked the rest of the way. Surrey in late June was exactly what Surrey had presumably always been: persistent, polite, and relentlessly tidy. The road she turned into announced itself through the quality of its hedgerows, which were extremely precise. The lawns were a shade of green that communicated strong opinions about watering schedules. She noted from the ministry file that Harry's uncle maintained the garden on weekends. The evidence supported this conclusion enthusiastically. She was cautious about visible magic near Muggles. The trace, the ministry's mechanism for monitoring underage spell use, detected magic in an area rather than identifying the specific caster, which meant a wand out in a Muggle suburb was inadvisable regardless of who was holding it. She kept her wand in her jacket pocket. She kept her hair, unfortunately, exactly as it was, because changing it on a public street in daylight presented its own set of complications. Number 4 was a house that looked like every other house on the street, which was to say, it was exactly correct, and said absolutely nothing. She had the address from the file, and she followed it along the pavement, and when she found it, she stopped. In the garden, there was a boy. He had his back to her, doing something methodical with a lawn-mower. She did what she had been trained to do, which was to form an assessment before she had consciously decided to start one. Thin. Genuinely thin. Not sick thin, but shortage thin, the kind that accumulates over seasons rather than appearing suddenly. His t-shirt was at least 2 sizes too large. His trousers had been rolled at the ankles to keep them from dragging. There was nothing about any of it that suggested the clothes belonged to him. She stood on the pavement and looked at him. He turned around. He clocked her immediately. She watched it happen. The small recalibration, his gaze moving from her face to her jacket to her hair, and then settling somewhere between alert and very careful. He was 13 years old. He had, according to the file, just finished a school year that had included discovering his convicted murderer godfather was actually innocent, and then watching that same godfather escape on a hippogriff, which was not the kind of conclusion that produced relaxed, open children. He went very still. She knew that stillness. She had seen it on adults in interview rooms. People constructing the careful version of their own face while they figured out what kind of problem the person in front of them was going to be. On a 13-year-old doing garden work in someone else's clothes, it sat wrong in a way she felt before she had words for it. "Hello," she said, and kept her voice easy. "I'm looking for Harry Potter." A beat. He had very green eyes. The scar was there on the left side of his forehead, a real thing, in a way that photographs never quite managed. "That's me," he said. "Nymphadora Tonks." "Don't, it's Tonks. I'm an Auror with the Department of Magical Law Enforcement." She held up her ministry identification. He looked at it. He looked at her. Some quiet calculation was running behind his expression that she could not fully read. "I've been sent to conduct a routine welfare check. Nothing alarming. This is standard procedure. Would your aunt be at home?" "She's inside," Harry said. He was being very careful. Not rude. Careful. The particular careful of someone who had been doing it long enough that it had become the default position. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the house. Then she said, "Right," and meant something slightly more complicated than right, though she kept that to herself. The walk up the path was 8 feet, possibly 10. She noted the garden. She noted the front door, dark paint, brass number 4, a cat flap at the bottom that she filed away without knowing why. She noted that Harry walked half a step ahead of her, and slightly to the side, which was the positioning of a person who had learned, through some process she was not yet going to speculate about, to put themselves between an unfamiliar adult and whatever was behind them. She rang the bell. She had come here this morning with a form and a very reasonable expectation of boredom. She still had the form. The expectation was already beginning to revise itself, quietly, without her permission. The door opened. Harry's aunt opened the door and stood in it, the way people stand in doorways when they have already decided how the next 5 minutes are going to go. Not quite blocking, not quite welcoming. Expression arranged into something that was not quite a smile and not quite its absence. She was angular and precise, in a way that suggested precision was a long-standing project. Her eyes moved over Tonks and stopped on the pink hair for 2 seconds, before moving away in the manner of someone who has decided that reacting would be beneath them. "You'd better come in," she said. The inside of the house was the outside made interior, every surface arranged past cleanliness into something closer to performance. The sitting room was visible from the hallway, cushions placed with geometric accuracy along the sofa, and a mantelpiece of photographs in matching frames. The family in them was a family of 3, a large man with a moustache, a woman who was clearly Harry's aunt at various ages, and a blonde boy growing from infant to the large, soft-faced teenager, currently sitting on the 4th stair, watching her with the expression of someone who had stationed himself there on purpose. Harry was not in any of the photographs. She noted this, smiled professionally, and took the seat she was offered. Harry came in behind her and took up a position near the kitchen doorway, not inside, at the threshold, in the way of someone who had learned to stand somewhere that was also an exit. "This is from the government, dear," Harry's aunt said to the boy on the stairs. The welfare forms were standard. She laid them on the kitchen table and began. "Is the child adequately fed?" "Yes." She wrote it down and looked at Harry across the table, at the t-shirt 2 sizes too large, at the wrists below the cuffs that were the particular thin of accumulated shortage, and wrote yes in the box and kept her face pleasant. Is the child provided with appropriate clothing for his age and needs? Harry's aunt's eyes moved briefly toward Harry and then away. Tonks wrote yes and noted the direction the look had gone. Is the child given access to educational materials in accordance with his school's requirements? Yes. His school was Hogwarts, which the form had not been designed for, but yes was the answer. She watched Harry's face, watching his aunt answer. He was watching with the stillness of someone listening to things being said about them by someone who had decided they were not in the room. The careful blank. None of the answers were lies. All of them sat at the very bottom of adequate, technically within the word's bounds, built to produce yes without committing to the full weight of it. She had seen this kind of answering from adults in interview rooms. "Could I see the bedroom?" she said. Purely standard. The bedroom was the smallest room on the upper floor. Bed fitted to the room, small desk, a window to the garden. On the outside of the door, a sliding bolt at adult height. Below it, cut into the base of the door, a cat flap. She noted both of them. Has he always had this room? Since he started school, Harry's aunt said. And before? 4 seconds. Harry was in the corridor. He had different arrangements. He was small. It suited the circumstances. Tonks said, "Of course," and wrote something down, and did not look up while she wrote it. She found the cupboard under the stairs herself on the way back down. Low wooden door under the staircase, hook-and-eye latch on the outside at adult height. She opened it. Coats. A vacuum cleaner. An ironing board. Behind the vacuum, at the back, a cot frame. Not packed for storage. Left. And on the inside of the door, at the height of a small child, written in felt tip that had been partially scrubbed and was entirely legible. Harry. She stayed still for a moment. The most famous child in Wizarding Britain had slept in this cupboard until he was old enough to go to school, and his name had been written on the door, and no one from their world had come to see it until now. She closed the door and straightened up and took out her quill and wrote on the parchment for considerably longer than the specific detail strictly required. When she looked up, Harry was watching her write. His face was still the careful blank from the garden, but his eyes were steadier, the particular steadiness of someone who has been carrying something alone and has just watched another person pick it up without being asked. He had not said a word. He knew what she was writing. She capped her quill. She said, "Mind if I go back up?" and didn't wait for the answer. At the small bedroom window, without fully intending to, her hair shifted from pink to a vivid and unsettled orange. A spider moved across the outer sill. The orange at the crown rearranged itself into something that could only be described as startled. In the corridor, Harry made a sound. It was almost a laugh, the sharp intake, the turn at the corner of his mouth. And then he caught it. She watched the reflex happen. Him registering the sound, his own chest had started, and closing around it before it could complete. One quiet movement. The almost laugh was not a laugh. He stood in the doorway with something light moving in his chest. Something genuinely funny was still happening, and the reflex had still closed without him deciding it would. He'd been doing that long enough that the closing was just what happened. He was aware of it this time, which was different. He was not sure, held there in the doorway, what he would have said if someone had asked why. She was looking at him. "Metamorphmagus," she said. "Hereditary. The editorial control is, I will be honest, somewhat overstated." A pause. Something was deciding itself in his expression. "Can you do it on purpose?" "Yes." Blue. Then a shade of yellow she had established was not flattering on anyone. He watched with the expression of someone losing an argument with themselves about what their face was allowed to do. Something fractionally shifted in his shoulders. "Gryffindor Seeker," she said. The file had it. "Yeah." Less managed than downstairs. She asked about Hogsmeade, and he described it properly. The sweet shop, the pub, the particular quality of a place where the strangeness was just the place. No explaining required. He had 2 friends, and talking about them was a different country from how he'd stood in the kitchen doorway. She let it run. She watched the difference and held it alongside the cot frame at the back of the cupboard. "What are summers usually like?" she asked, when enough warmth had built. He went quiet. He looked at the window. The garden outside was very tidy. "Fine," he said eventually. "It's fine." The blank was back. She did not push. She thanked him downstairs with the warmth that communicated professional satisfaction and revealed nothing else. She thanked his aunt and said she would follow up if any items required it. She said goodbye to the large boy who had relocated from the stairs to the sitting room doorway during proceedings and who blinked at her twice and said nothing. Outside, she sat on the low garden wall. The suburb committed to its morning without drama. A sprinkler ran 2 doors down. A radio was just audible from an open window. She had her parchment on her knee, her quill in her hand, and the completed form, and she read the summary conclusion box. No welfare concerns identified. Routine follow-up not required. She looked at the front door. Dark paint, brass number 4, a cat flap at the bottom. She looked at it for a while. Then she turned the parchment over. She wrote the bolt on the outside of the bedroom door, the cat flap beneath it, the cupboard under the stairs, the latch at adult height, the cot frame in the back, the name in letters on the inside of the door. She wrote the photographs on the mantelpiece, and whose face was absent from them. She wrote the answers to the welfare questions and what she had noticed while they were being given, and what Harry Potter's face had looked like when she wrote it down, and what it meant that a boy of 13 had heard something funny and stopped the laugh before it happened. Her pen kept moving. She read the report back to herself once. The emergency removal clause was in the Auror Field Manual, Chapter 7, Paragraph 3. She had read it twice during training. Once because she was supposed to, and once because her senior training officer had suggested, in the understated manner of someone who had seen considerably more of the world, that it would be worth knowing. An Auror, who documents evidence of ongoing neglect or harm in the course of an official welfare check, is authorized to take immediate protective action pending formal ministry review. She had the documentation. She had written it in enough specific detail that no one was going to argue with it and come out looking better for having tried. She stood up. She walked back up the garden path and rang the bell. Harry's aunt opened the door with the expression of someone who had been waiting, at some level, for this particular moment to arrive, and who had decided that composure was the only available response. "I need to speak to Harry," Tonks said. "And then I'll need him to pack his things." His aunt stood back and let her in. Harry came downstairs when called. He stopped on the third step. He looked at Tonks and at his aunt's face, and performed the rapid assessment she was already recognizing as his characteristic approach to new information, taking in all of it simultaneously, arriving at a provisional conclusion without committing to a reaction. What crossed his face was not quite surprise, and not quite relief. It was the face of someone who had hoped for something a long time and learned to be suspicious of hope. "Am I leaving?" he said. "If you'd like to. I have authority to facilitate a temporary relocation pending a formal welfare review. That means you can come with me, or you can stay. Your choice." He looked at his aunt. His aunt looked at the floor. "I'll pack," he said. He was back in 7 minutes. She noted it from the hallway. He had not needed to decide what to bring, which meant he had already known. The way you know things you have thought through quietly over a long time without quite admitting you were thinking them. His possessions were few. He had kept them ready, in the way of someone who had understood, without being told, that readiness was worth maintaining. He carried the trunk to the front door without help or difficulty, in the way of someone accustomed to doing things without help. He had very green eyes, and in the light of the hallway they were vivid and watchful, and giving nothing away. He looked 13, and he looked older in the way that children look older when they have been carrying specific things. "Is there anything you need to say goodbye to?" she said. "No," he said, and picked up the trunk. They walked together down the garden path. When Harry's feet crossed the low front step from garden to pavement, when he walked out of 4 Privet Drive, and neither of them knew it was for the last time, nothing happened. The street was quiet. The world made no acknowledgement. There was a blood charm on that house, built into the walls by an act of maternal sacrifice, and maintained by the act of annual return. It required Harry to call the house home, to live there, to come back to it, to let it be the anchor. It existed because his aunt carried his mother's blood in her veins, and it had held for 13 years through the accumulated misery of every summer, because he always came back. He had just stopped coming back. He did not know this. Tonks did not know this. Dumbledore in his office at Hogwarts did not yet know it either. The street continued to be a street, and the morning continued to be a morning, and the charm that had kept Harry Potter alive through his early childhood quietly ceased to exist. Tonks raised her wand at the curb. The night bus arrived with its customary lack of ceremony, a thunderclap of displaced air, and then the purple triple-decker, lurching to a stop at an angle that suggested parallel parking, was a matter of personal philosophy. The conductor swung out with a grin, Harry stared at it. He had taken it before, last summer, running from his aunt and uncle's house, in the dark, alone, 13 years old, flagging it down in a moment of desperation and paying out of his own pocket and giving a false name and riding hunched small in the manner of someone hoping not to be noticed or asked about. He was standing on the pavement now with his trunk and an Auror beside him, and no one in pursuit, and the bus was the same bus, but the circumstances were entirely different, and she thought she could see the difference on his face if she looked for it. Something less braced about the jaw, something in the set of the shoulders that was not quite ease, but was pointing in that direction. "After you," she said. The Tonks family house was outside Little Whinging, and the night bus achieved it in the lurching, wall-bending manner of a vehicle that treated physical space as approximate. When they disembarked, Harry stood on the pavement for a moment and simply breathed. Tonks knocked. Andromeda Tonks opened the door. She looked at Tonks. She looked at the thin boy with the round glasses and the scar and the school trunk. She looked at Tonks again. "Come in," she said, in a tone that communicated several things, chief among them. "We are going to discuss this." Ted Tonks appeared from the kitchen with a tea towel, took in the same scene, and said, "Cup of tea?" to Harry specifically. "Milk? Sugar?" Harry said, "Yes, please. Both." He sat at the kitchen table, and Ted put the kettle on, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of something close to bread, and Tonks watched Harry Potter's shoulders drop approximately 1 centimetre. He had not breathed properly since she'd rung the bell. She followed her mother to the far end of the kitchen. "How much trouble are you in?" Andromeda said, quietly. "Moderate. Possibly significant. I documented everything. It's a legitimate removal. I had grounds." "I'm sure you did." Her mother looked at Harry across the kitchen. "Do you know who that is?" "Harry Potter. It's in the file." "And his godfather?" "Sirius Black, yes, I'm aware. Sirius Black is my first cousin." Andromeda's voice was even. "And that boy is the reason Sirius would do anything, including escape Azkaban, to remain in the world." She let a moment pass. "You did not do a simple welfare removal today. When you brought a Potter here, Sirius's godson, James Potter's son, a child connected by blood oath and legal record to one of the oldest houses in Wizarding Britain. You stepped into the middle of something, not sideways out of it. The House of Black is not dormant. It has never been dormant. And you have just moved one of its central pieces." Tonks did not answer. Across the kitchen, Harry was accepting a mug from Ted and holding it with both hands. She showed Harry the spare bedroom after tea, a window to the back garden, a bed that was the right size, curtains that were not what he would have chosen, but not offensive. She put his trunk at the foot of the bed. "It's temporary," she said. "While the review is processed, I'm filing the full report tomorrow morning, and someone senile will make the final determination. But in the meantime—" "Thank you," Harry said. He was sitting on the bed with his hands in his lap, looking at the window. She was halfway to the door when Andromeda came in behind her, set a second mug on the nightstand without comment, and left. Harry looked at it for a moment. Then he picked it up and held it with both hands. He was in a room that was not a cupboard, and not the smallest room in a house that did not want him, and someone had brought him tea without being asked. The chapter ended before he had to say anything about it. The portrait of Armando Dippet had been saying something for approximately 12 minutes. Dumbledore did not look up. He was drafting a letter to the International Confederation of Wizards regarding a proposed revision to the Statute of Secrecy, a matter of procedural delicacy that required very careful language. And he had been at it since 6:30 in the morning. This was not unusual, Summer at Hogwarts was, despite common assumption, not a period of rest. It was a period of performing a different set of obligations without 500 children present to interrupt them. There were letters to write, appointments to keep, and at least 4 situations in various stages of quiet diplomatic resolution that required his attention and his discretion and his ability to write things that said what he meant without saying what he meant. The office was quiet in the way that very old stone rooms are quiet, not silent, but underlaid with its own ambient sounds. Fawkes was asleep on his perch, a heap of crimson and gold with closed eyes. The instruments on the shelves gave off their faint, clockwork murmuring. The portraits of former headmasters conducted their usual low-level conversations, the ones they had when they thought he wasn't listening. Outside the windows, the grounds were empty and green, and the lake was still, and the castle breathed around him the way it always breathed, slowly, with enormous patience. "You should eat something," said the portrait of Armando Dippet. "I had something at 6, said Dumbledore without looking up. "Thank you, Armando." The portrait made a sound that was not quite a harumph and returned to watching the room. Dumbledore dipped his quill, and the notification arrived. He felt it the way he felt most things of this kind, which was immediately and without drama. A monitoring charm, placed years ago on the blood protection at 4 Privet Drive. Not intrusive, not announcing itself in any visible way. Simply there, the way he had learned to keep tabs on things that mattered too much to leave unobserved. The charm did not make a sound. There was no owl, no Patronus, no formal alert. There was only a change in the quality of a thing, the way a fire changes when it goes out. A presence that had been there becoming an absence. He set down his quill. For a moment he was simply still, in the manner of very old men who have learned that the first response to an unexpected thing is rarely the wisest. The room continued its murmurings. Fawkes breathed on his perch. Then he thought, Harry. The blood protection on 4 Privet Drive had been constructed from a sacrifice. Lily Evans, Lily Potter, had died choosing to stand between her son and Lord Voldemort, and that choice had produced what love occasionally produces when it is sufficiently and absolutely real. Magic that did not fit the usual categories. Not a charm in the technical sense. Not a ward that could be mapped and countered. Something older and stranger, woven into the act of dying for someone. It had attached itself to the only blood relative who had consented to take the child in, and it had held for 13 years. While Harry lived in that house, under that roof, with his mother's blood in the walls around him, while Petunia Dursley took him in and kept him, the protection held. Voldemort could not touch him there. His followers, the ones who had escaped justice, or had escaped Azkaban, or had claimed, successfully, that they had acted under compulsion, could not reach him there. The charm was specific, particular, and for the purposes of keeping one child alive through a dangerous period, it had been sufficient. It required Harry to return each summer. To call it home, not as performance, not as declaration, but as genuine center of gravity, the place he came back to. The intent mattered. The act of return mattered. If he never came back, if the connection was severed not by violence but by absence, the protection ended. He had known this. He had always known this. He had known it when he placed Harry on the Dursleys' doorstep in the first hour of November 13 years ago, with a letter folded into the blanket, and the reasonable certainty that he was making the right decision, and the less comfortable certainty that right decisions and easy decisions were rarely the same thing. He had also known about the Dursleys. This was what he was required to hold honestly, and he was practiced enough to do it without flinching and without offering himself absolution. He had not known everything. The specific dimensions of the boy's early years had not been available to him, and he had constructed his understanding of the household from a distance through the informal reports of a squib who lived nearby and kept occasional watch. But he had known that Petunia Dursley was not a warm woman, and that Vernon Dursley was not a patient man, and that the household was not one that would have chosen to take in a magical child. He had known the boy would not be loved there, or at least not loved well, or at least loved in ways that were insufficient, and he had made the calculation. The blood protection's value exceeded the cost of unkindness. A child who suffered in a house where no magic could reach him was preferable, as a strategic matter, to a child who was comfortable in a house where Voldemort's remaining followers could find him. It had not been cruelty. It had been survival arithmetic of the most rigorous kind, performed at a moment when the order of the world was such that rigorous arithmetic was the only available form of care. He had known what he was choosing. He had chosen it with open eyes, and he had carried it forward, and he had not permitted himself to look back at it more than was absolutely necessary, because looking back at calculations you cannot reverse is a form of self-indulgence that he could not, historically, afford. The welfare check had not been part of his arrangements. These things happened in the ordinary course of bureaucratic obligation assigned to the most junior person available, because routine things go to junior staff. And junior staff, he now understood, occasionally documented what they found with complete accuracy, and invoked the authority they were fully entitled to invoke. The blood protection was gone. The ministry now had a formal welfare removal on record. Harry Potter was not at Privet Drive, and could not be returned to it without a formal review that would not, given the documented conditions, result in his reinstatement. The consequences of this were already in motion, and were not retrievable. He allowed himself a moment of stillness. Then he took a fresh sheet of parchment and wrote a formal letter to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement requesting a meeting with the Auror, who had filed the welfare removal report. Through proper channels, through the correct offices, Harry's removal was now an official record, and he would respond officially, and it would be visible to anyone who cared to look that he had responded officially. There were reasons for this. When that letter was sealed, he took another sheet and wrote a shorter note to Remus Lupin. Remus had the particular intelligence of someone who read the spaces between sentences more attentively than the sentences themselves. He had always found that shorter letters to Remus were more effective than longer ones. He wrote, "Harry is no longer at Privet Drive. I thought you should know." He did not say more. He did not need to. He sealed both letters, sent them with owls, and rose from his desk and went to the window. The grounds were peaceful in the particular way of Hogwarts in summer. Everything present, everything in its place, the castle's weight arranged around him like a fact of geography. He could see the lake, and the edge of the forest, and the Quidditch pitch, and the beech tree by the lake where, 30 years ago, a group of 4 boys had spent a great deal of time doing things they were not supposed to be doing, while he watched from this same window and calculated what they would become. He thought about Lily Evans. He thought about a November morning, 13 years ago, the specific coldness of that particular dark before dawn, and a baby sleeping in a bundle of blankets on a doorstep, and a letter that explained nothing because nothing could be explained yet, addressed to people who had not asked for any of this, and would have refused it if they could. He had set the child down. He had stood at the end of the garden path for a moment, and he had looked at the house, and done what he always did, which was, let the decision be made, confirm it was made, and go, because staying would not change it, and there was always more work. He had made a calculation. The calculation had held for 13 years. A 20-year-old Auror with pink hair had filed a welfare report, and the calculation was over. He did not permit himself, for more than a moment, to wonder whether it should have ended sooner. He had work to do. The gargoyle moved aside without being asked, which Tonks found unsettling in a way she couldn't immediately account for. She climbed the revolving staircase with her parchment under her arm, and her welfare report in her inner pocket, and the specific determination of someone who has done something defensible and knows that defensible and comfortable are not the same thing. She had never been to the headmaster's office. She had attended this school for 7 years and graduated 2 years ago, and somehow this particular room had remained unvisited, which now felt like an oversight. The door was open. She knocked on the frame. "Miss Tonks," said Dumbledore. "Please come in." The office was full of things that looked back at you, portraits watching with the attentive quality of painted eyes that have had centuries to practice, instruments on the shelves giving off small, purposeful light, a phoenix on its perch regarding her with the frank assessment of a creature that has outlived everyone it has known. Dumbledore himself was behind his desk, tall even seated, with a long silver beard and half-moon spectacles, and a nose heeled at a slight angle, and his eyes were very blue and rather more attentive than she had prepared herself for. Her hair was still pink. She had considered changing it before the meeting, and then decided not to, on the grounds that she wasn't going to manage Albus Dumbledore's reaction to her hair. "Sit down," he said, pleasantly. "Tea." "Please," she said, because refusal felt like a tactical error. He told her about the blood protection, the way he told her everything else that morning, calmly, completely, without any apparent accusation in his voice. Lily Potter, he said, had died for her son. The love expressed in that specific act had created something that did not fall neatly into any of the usual magical categories. While Harry lived with his mother's blood, while his aunt took him in and kept him year after year, it held. Voldemort, though reduced to a shade of himself and not yet restored to a body, was not inert. His most loyal followers had walked free from the war by various means, claiming coercion they had not felt, and they retained the capacity to act. Without the blood protection, they retained the capacity to find Harry Potter. She listened. She did not interrupt. When he finished, she said, "The price was a cupboard." He looked at her across the desk. "I beg your pardon?" The blood protection was anchored to that house, to that family. And the boy lived in a cupboard under the stairs for the first 10 years of his life, with his name written on the inside of the door, and no one from our world came to see it. She kept her voice level, because she had made a decision in the gargoyle corridor that she was going to be professional about this, or she was going to be nothing at all. "I have it in my report. The cot frame is still there. He had a lock on the outside of his bedroom door that required an adult arm to reach." "I know," said Dumbledore. The silence that followed was not comfortable, and was not supposed to be. "You knew," she said. "I knew the household was not a kind one." He did not look away, which she had half expected him to. "I knew he would not be comfortable there. The protection's value, over 12 years of an incomplete war in which the other side still had operatives and the capacity to act. I calculated that value against the cost of his comfort, and I made a decision. I would not make a different one, with the information I had at the time. I do not ask you to find that acceptable." She didn't. She let that sit on the table between them. "The alternative," he said, "was a dead child." They were both right. She understood that in her stomach, in a way she hadn't before she sat down. They were both right, and the argument did not resolve, and after a moment she let it settle because the practical reality was already in front of them and could not wait for the argument to finish. "The report is in the system," she said. "Filed yesterday morning. Harry cannot be returned to Privet Drive without a formal ministry welfare review, and the review will not conclude in reinstatement. I documented everything. The lock, the cat flap, the cupboard, the photographs on the mantelpiece." She paused. "He wasn't in any of them." Dumbledore was quiet. "You can't undo this without a political incident that ends your position on the Wizengamot," she said. "I'm sorry. I don't say that to threaten you. I say it because it's the situation, and I'd rather we both understand it clearly." He said, "You are very direct, Miss Tonks. I'm a very junior Auror who has just done something irreversible. I don't have room to be indirect." He almost smiled. It was a precise, considered almost smile that communicated a great deal without performing any of it. "Then what do you propose?" he said. She had thought about this since her mother had told her what Harry Potter's presence in their house meant. Standard ministry welfare procedure would produce a reassignment to an administrative guardian, someone who had never known James Potter, which would not be better, and which would not address the question already sitting in the room between them. She named it. "Sirius Black," she said. "He is Harry's godfather. He was designated legally before his arrest, and that designation has never been formally revoked. If Harry's custody is in question, and it is as of yesterday, then Sirius Black's claim is formally in question too." She kept her hands still on her knees. "I am of black blood through my mother, Andromeda Black before she was Tonks. I am petitioning the Wizengamot under the ancient rights of the most ancient and noble House of Black to have Harry's custody reviewed under House protocols. The House holds a hereditary seat. The right of petition is established." Dumbledore went very still. She had seen adults go still in a variety of ways, and this particular stillness had the quality of a man recalculating with extraordinary speed the full landscape of a situation he had not expected to look like this. "You understand what that forces?" he said. "Yes. It forces consideration of Sirius's claim as godfather, which means Sirius must either appear before the Wizengamot voluntarily, or formally forfeit his claim in a legal proceeding that puts his name in front of a court. Either way, his status is forced into the open." She met his eyes, which required something she was choosing to call professionalism, and which might equally have been called stubbornness. "I cannot withdraw the invocation once submitted. It can only be resolved by a ruling. I told you because you should know. I'm not apologizing." He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "I don't imagine you are." She left the castle the way she'd arrived, and stood for a moment on the stone steps with the lake in front of her, and the whole weight of the morning in her chest. She had committed. She could not uncommit. The invocation was already written and already filed, and somewhere Sirius Black was in hiding, and didn't know yet that his name was now formally before the Wizengamot, and somewhere Harry Potter was at her mother's kitchen table, and that was the part she kept coming back to. 31st of July, 1994. Harry Potter turned 14 at the kitchen table of the Tonks household, which was not where he had expected to be, and which was better than where he had been. Andromeda had produced a cake in the morning, with the particular efficiency of a woman who had decided this was happening, and had not made a ceremony of deciding it. It had chocolate icing, and 14 candles, and it was real, which he kept noticing. Ted had attempted to supplement the occasion with a Muggle party kit that had included balloons. The balloons had resisted all magical inflation with an obstinacy that transcended both worlds, and Ted had eventually produced 3 partially inflated ones of different sizes and propped them against the cake stand with the serene confidence of a man who considers effort its own reward. "Happy birthday," Andromeda said, and placed the cake in front of him. He had had birthday cakes before. They had appeared on his Hogwarts birthdays, the school's mechanisms being what they were, and he had had them from his friends. But there was something specifically different about a cake made by a person who had had no reason to make it, except that it was his birthday, and birthdays required cake. And he held that difference in his chest for a moment before he said, "Thank you." Because thank you was the only appropriate response, and it did not come close to the actual weight of what he wanted to say, which was something he did not have words for yet. He blew out the candles. One of Ted's balloons subsided slowly against the cake stand. Harry laughed. It was a real laugh. He did not catch it. The dog did not dream about Azkaban. This was the point of the dog. Padfoot slept on the stone floor of the cave, with his nose tucked under his tail, and breathed the clean, cold air that came off the mountain. And when he dreamed the way dogs dream, twitching, imprecise, chasing something through a field that had no particular meaning. The man could not have slept like that. The man lay awake in the dark and smelled 12 years of Dementor cold, and counted the months since the cell door, and the stone walls of the cave became the stone walls of something else, and the breathing in the dark became something that had nothing to do with wind. So, the dog. The dog was easier. He had been in the cave for weeks. He had been in hiding for over a year. The cave was recent, the Hogsmeade proximity recent, the choice to stay close to the only place where he might get word of Harry recent in the way that recent means, more carefully considered than it looked. The Ministry thought him somewhere in the south. Let them. The note arrived in the early morning, pushed through the narrow opening in the rock with the particular care of someone who had placed it precisely, not thrown it. He shifted without thinking. The man kneeling on the cave floor, reading in the thin grey light. Lupin's handwriting in the opening lines. He would have known it anywhere. Remus had always written with the careful penmanship of someone who had learned early that clarity was a form of consideration. The tone was Lupin's, measured, choosing every word. And then, partway down the page, it changed. The phrasing became formal, legal, a sentence that was clearly not Remus's work, but had been put into plain language by someone who wanted to make sure he understood it. He read it 3 times. 3 facts. Harry was no longer at Privet Drive. Harry was safe. The most ancient and noble house of Black had formally invoked its ancient rights before the Wizengamot. He sat for a long time on the cave floor with the note in his hands. Harry was safe. He said it to himself in the quiet of the cave, and felt something shift in his chest that had been locked into position for months. A held breath he hadn't known he was holding, released all at once. Harry was safe. Someone had gone to that house and seen it, and done something about it, and it was not him, because it had never been him, because he had not been able to be the person who did things for Harry for 13 years. But someone had. Someone had. He could breathe around that fact. He let himself. Harry was no longer at Privet Drive. The second fact followed differently from the first. He had not engineered this. He had not been there, had not known, had not managed or arranged or been consulted. Some Auror or Ministry official had gone to Little Whinging on bureaucratic obligation and looked at a house and looked at a boy and drawn the conclusion that anyone with eyes would draw. The conclusion that he had known, from everything he had heard second-hand and inferred from the edges of things, was correct. The conclusion that Dumbledore had apparently lived alongside for 13 years. He did not let himself go down that particular corridor for long. He did not have the luxury of the anger yet. The third fact was waiting. The most ancient and noble house of Black had invoked its rights before the Wizengamot. He read the formal line again, in the handwriting that was not Remus's. Someone had put it in plain language for him. He understood it clearly. He understood what it meant that the house's rights had been formally invoked. Who held those rights? Who could invoke them? And who, as the lord of the house, was now structurally required to respond? He understood that he couldn't forfeit. He had never been able to forfeit. He had known that in the marrow, which was the kind of knowing that has nothing to do with thought. He put the note down on the cave floor and let himself be the man sitting in a cave in Scotland and think about James. Not as an exercise. Not deliberately. James arrived the way James always arrived, when he needed to think something through to its real bottom, through the back of the thought, the way light comes around a corner. Sirius had spent 12 years in a cell trying not to think about James, because thinking about James in that place, with the Dementors drawing all the warmth out of everything, had been the fastest way to go under. He had thought about James being dead. He had thought about James being dead because of Peter, who he had trusted, because of a choice that he had made, and could not unmake. He had thought about those things until thought itself became a kind of injury, and then he had stopped thinking, and Padfoot had been the answer to that too. The dog didn't carry James, only the man did. But here, in the cave, with the note on the floor and the question before him, here he let James come. James at 16, which was where Sirius's memory lived most fully. Not the later years, not the Lily years, not the wedding and the baby and the too short time that came after. But 16, on the Quidditch pitch in the late afternoon light with his untidy black hair and his glasses, and the absolute certainty that the universe was arranged in reasonable proportion to his specific gifts. And the thing about that certainty was that it was infectious, was the thing about James, and Sirius had spent enough time near it that some of it had gotten into him permanently. James naming him Godfather. Not at 16. Later, when the war was already going badly, and people they knew were dying, and James had a son in a crib and the future looked like a thing to be defended inch by inch. He had said, "If anything happens to us," he had not said it like a request. He had said it like a statement of fact, the way James said things he had already decided. "If anything happens to us, Padfoot, you're it. You're the one." As though there had been no other option, and the question was simply whether Sirius understood it. He had understood it. He had said yes. He had not made a speech about it, because James would have found a speech embarrassing. And besides, there had not been time for speeches by then. There was never enough time by then. And they had moved on to something else, and Sirius had carried the yes with him, like something he had been trusted to hold. He had been holding it ever since. 13 years of holding a trust that he could not act on, from a cell and then from the margins of the world, and here was the chance to act on it. Not a perfect chance, not a safe chance, not a chance that came without the prospect of what came after, if it went wrong. The Dementors. He let himself think about them, which he usually did not do voluntarily, because they deserved to be thought about clearly before he made a decision that might put him back in front of them. What 12 years with them had been, the way they drew everything good and warm and worth having out of a person, and left only the cold and the worst things, the memories you would choose anything to lose. He had survived once. He had survived by holding on to something, a truth, the one clean thing he had left, and the truth had been his innocence, which was something cold and abstract enough that the Dementors could not entirely devour it. If he went to the ministry and something went wrong, if Veritaserum wasn't administered, if Fudge overrode the process, if the Wizengamot voted against the evidence, he went back. He was 34 years old, and he had survived 12 years, and he did not believe he survived them again. He took a scrap of parchment. He wrote, "Dumbledore, I am coming in. Do not let them move Harry before I arrive. S.B." He looked at it for a long time. He was not a coward. He had never been a coward. That was not the thing. The thing was that he had known what coming back to the world meant, and had been afraid of it, and had stayed at the edges of it, because the edges were survivable, and the middle was not guaranteed. He had told himself, when there is something worth the risk. He had told himself, when Harry needs it. Harry needed it. He folded the note and sealed it and held it in his hand. The cave was exactly as cold as it had been 5 minutes ago. The light through the opening was the same early grey. Everything was the same, except that he had decided. He sent the note. He shifted out of the dog and sat on the cave floor as himself, gaunt, hollow-cheeked, 34 years old, and absolutely terrified. And then he stood up. He had work to do. By early August, Harry had a routine, which was not something he had expected to acquire, and which had arrived without his deciding to acquire it. He was up before anyone else most mornings. He had always been an early riser, which had less to do with natural preference than with the fact that at Privet Drive, the mornings before the house woke up, had been the only time that was fully, reliably his own. He made tea for himself quietly, leaving everything as he found it, and sat with it at the kitchen table while the house was still. When Andromeda or Ted came down, he was already dressed, and had usually washed up whatever he'd used. He helped with the dishes, after meals, without being asked. He kept his room neat, neater, probably, than it needed to be, the kind of neatness that comes from having learned early that visible disorder was something that attracted attention of a particular kind. He never asked for seconds, unless offered. It had taken him 2 weeks to notice he was doing this. Ted had caught it first. He'd put something on the table and served himself and served Andromeda, and then looked at Harry and said, "More?" And Harry had said, "No, thank you," before he'd processed the question, and Ted had said, "There's plenty," in a way that was not a correction, but was something, and Harry had taken more, and it had felt like an act requiring more deliberate effort than it should. The letters had been arriving since the 2nd week. He was not told what they said. Andromeda read them at the kitchen table and folded them and set them aside, with the expression of someone who is used to managing information and is choosing what to share, which was a precise expression, and told him roughly as much as the letters would have. He knew the shape of what was happening, even without the content. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement had been in touch. The Wizengamot had issued a scheduling notice. He had seen that one by accident, lying on the hall table in its official ministry envelope, with the seal pressed into the wax. Tonks came home later and later in the evenings, and sat at the table with tea she did not finish, and did not talk about her day. He understood, with a clarity that was not comfortable, that he was the shape at the center of all of it. Tonks's career was under scrutiny. Andromeda had been required to document her fitness as a temporary guardian to people who did not know her, and would not, without documentation, believe her to be adequate. Ted Tonks, who was Muggle-born, had been required to confirm that his blood status did not constitute a disqualifying factor in wizarding welfare arrangements, which was the kind of question that was delivered in administrative language and still meant what it meant. And then there was Sirius Black, whose name was now formally before the Wizengamot because of a petition Tonks had filed on Harry's behalf, and Sirius Black was Harry's godfather and had been a fugitive for a year, and the invocation meant he would have to respond or forfeit, and Harry knew, with the same flat, accumulating certainty with which he knew all difficult things, that Sirius would not forfeit. His mother had died for him. Sirius had spent 12 years in Azkaban for something he did not do, and the invocation Tonks had filed now meant he would have to come in or forfeit, and Tonks was being asked to account for herself in formal ministry correspondence, and Andromeda was writing defensive letters, and Ted was having his blood status formally queried. People paid for him. He had not asked them to. That had never seemed to matter. He was sitting on the back step the night Andromeda found him, which was not a night that was different from the others in any particular way, except that he had been unable to make himself go back inside. The garden was dark. The air was warm and still. He had been sitting there for something over an hour. Andromeda sat down beside him without preamble. She was not a person who performed comfort. She produced it through proximity and precision. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the dark garden and said nothing long enough that Harry understood she was not going anywhere. "I was burned off the family tree," she said, eventually. Not as confession, as information. The Black family tapestry at Grimmauld Place. There's a burn hold where I was. When you marry someone the family considers unacceptable, they don't merely disown you. They remove the evidence, Harry said. Ted. Yes, he is Muggle-born, and I loved him, and I married him, and they burned me off the tree. She said it with the precision of someone who has had sufficient years to make peace with a thing and remains clear-eyed about what the thing was. Sirius Black is my first cousin. He's burned off too, now, in another way, in the practical sense, though I don't imagine the portrait has been updated. Whatever he has done or not done, or is accused of, he is my family. Harry was quiet. "I am not telling you this so you feel better," she said. "I am telling you because you keep looking at this house as though you are calculating the trouble you cost it. We look after family. Sirius is family. You are connected to him, and to us by extension, and that is not a transaction. It does not have a ledger." He did not know what to do with this. He kept it the way he kept things that were too large to process immediately. Set it somewhere careful, held it. Remus Lupin arrived 3 days later, in the early evening, in the way of a man who had been travelling for longer than the journey should have taken. He was thin, thinner than Harry remembered, with patched robes and hair greyer than seemed right for 34, and he looked at Harry in the doorway with an expression that was a great many things held in careful proximity. "Harry," he said. "Professor," said Harry, and then, "Sorry." "Remus," said Lupin, and something in his face shifted, as though the correction mattered in a way he was not going to explain. Andromeda let him in, and Ted put the kettle on, and they sat at the kitchen table, and Lupin wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at Harry with the expression of a man who has been deciding how to say something, and has decided to say it plainly. "Sirius is coming in," Lupin said. Harry went still. "He's making himself available to the ministry. He will come to the Wizengamot, and he will submit to Veritaserum examination, if they permit it, and the truth will come out if the process is allowed to work correctly." Lupin's voice was even in the way of someone who has held a difficult thing for a long time and learned to carry it without showing the weight. "He is frightened. I told him I would tell you that. He asked me to make sure you knew that it is not easy. He is not doing it because it is easy. He is doing it because you are worth the fear." Harry looked at the table. He did not say anything for a while. "Everyone around me ends up in danger," he said, eventually. He said it the way he said flat things, not as complaint, not looking for disagreement, just putting the observation where it was. Lupin regarded him. "You didn't ask to need protecting." "That doesn't change. Neither did we," Lupin said. "None of us asked for this particular situation. We are here because we choose to be here. That is the difference between what the Dursleys did and what Sirius is doing, what Tonks has done, what this household is. One was an obligation they resented every day. This is a choice, made with full knowledge of the cost, and we make it willingly." He paused. "You are not the cause of the danger, Harry. The danger existed before you were born. The people in this situation are not here because of you. They're here despite everything, and for you, and that is not the same as you costing them something." Harry did not answer. He pushed his tea mug on the table, and Lupin let him not answer, which was one of the things about Lupin. The silences with him were not pressure. He went back inside, upstairs, and left Lupin and Andromeda at the kitchen table. The house was quiet. Ted had gone to read in the sitting room. The kitchen was just the two of them and the low warmth of it, and Lupin held his tea with both hands, the way he held most things, carefully, as though he was aware of his own grip. There was a photograph on the wall beside the dresser. Andromeda and Ted, on some occasion, younger than they were now, in the particular brightness of a day that had been important, and beside them, a child, 4 or 5, arms spread wide, hair cycling through every color it had apparently ever considered, captured in the shifting light of a wizarding photograph. Lupin looked at it. He looked at it for a moment. Then he turned away and asked Andromeda if she had heard from Dumbledore this week, and they talked about logistics and schedules and the Wizengamot notice. And outside the window the late August dark settled over the garden, and somewhere north of them, Sirius Black was moving. She had reviewed the welfare report 3 times. She had consulted, at some expense of money and pride, a practitioner specializing in the legal history of the ancient houses. She had slept badly for 5 nights. She had changed her hair to something more professional on the walk to the gargoyle, and changed it back to pink before the gargoyle moved, because she was not going to manage Dumbledore's reaction to her hair. The office felt different the second time. The portraits paid attention in a way she understood now they had been doing all along. Dumbledore was at his desk, with the particular quality of someone who has had a week to prepare, which was more time than she had wanted to give him. He did not offer tea. He said, "Sit down," and began. Lord Voldemort, he said, was not inert. Reduced to spirit since 1981, yes, but not without intent, and not without servants. His most loyal followers had walked free by various means, and had not stopped being his followers. They were looking for ways to restore him. The process was ongoing. The blood protection was, he said, the most powerful protective magic available. He was precise. Not the most powerful charm or ward that could be cast, but more fundamental, sealed by an act of love, which had a quality that defensive enchantments cast from strategic intention could not replicate. It had been passive, permanent. It required no maintenance, no protective detail to exhaust or bribe. As long as Harry returned, as long as his aunt kept him, no servant of Voldemort could touch him there. Without it, Harry must be defended actively. By people. The resources required would be significant, and the margin for error non-zero. Active defenses could be broken. The blood protection could not be broken by anything except Harry's absence. "There is nothing equivalent," Dumbledore said. "There is no alternative that would have been as reliable or as lasting." Tonks had been listening. She continued to listen. When he finished, she sat with it for a moment, because she had decided before she arrived that she was not going to be precipitous. "I don't dispute the magic," she said. "I've read everything I can find about it. I understand what the blood protection was and what it cost to build it." He waited. "You sacrificed his childhood to people who despised him," she said. "And you didn't check. For 13 years, no one from our world put a welfare form in front of that family. When I did, on a bureaucratic obligation, as the most junior Auror available, the answers were technically yes, and the child had been kept in a cupboard under the stairs for the first 10 years of his life, with his name written on the inside of the door." She kept her voice level. "He has a lock on the outside of his bedroom door. He packed in 7 minutes when I told him he could leave, because he had always kept his things ready, which is what children do when they have learned that the place they live might stop tolerating them. The blood protection protected him from Death Eaters." She paused. "Who protected him from the Dursleys?" The silence that followed was of a specific kind. Not the silence of a man who has no answer. The silence of a man who has carried an answer for a long time and is now being required to put it on a table where another person can see it. Dumbledore removed his half-moon spectacles. He set them very carefully on the desk in front of him. He looked at her, and she understood in that moment something she had not understood the first time she sat in this office, which was that the things in his face were real things, and had been there a long time, and were not being performed for her benefit. "I knew," he said. "I knew the household was not a kind one. I knew he would not be loved there. I made a careful calculation, that the protection's value over an incomplete war, with adversaries still in the world, exceeded the cost of his unhappiness." A pause. It was a long pause. "I believed the protection was worth the cost. I do not say I was right." Neither of them said anything. "I do not say I was wrong either," he said quietly. "I say that I believed it, and that I chose to believe it, and that there was not a morning in 13 years when I was not aware of what I had chosen. I am not asking you to find that adequate." She didn't. She let that be on the table between them, too. "The practical situation," she said after a moment, because that was where they had to go. "Yes." He replaced his spectacles. "Harry cannot be returned to Privet Drive without a ministry welfare review. Your report makes that all but certain to fail. The House of Black invocation is before the Wizengamot and cannot be withdrawn. I have received word from Sirius Black that he intends to present himself to the ministry." "Yes. The Wizengamot date will be set within a fortnight." He looked at her with the attentive blue eyes. "I am Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot. I cannot be seen to interfere with a Wizengamot process. You are aware of this?" "Yes," she said. "I was aware of it when I filed the petition." He was quiet for a moment. Not, she thought, with any particular emotion she could name. With something more like the expression of a man who has been very thoroughly and legally outmaneuvered, and who is old enough to recognize it without taking it personally. "You are very young," he said. And it was not a criticism, which surprised her slightly. 21, she said. "Yes." He looked at the window for a moment. 21, and newly qualified, and you have upended 15 years of careful management in the space of a welfare form and a legal petition. He turned back. "I want you to know that I am glad Harry is no longer in that house, whatever the cost of the alternatives. I should have said that sooner." She went out. She went down the revolving staircase and through the castle and out the main doors, and stood on the steps for a moment with the lake in front of her. And she thought, right. All right. She had heard the full argument. She had not been wrong, and neither had he, and the argument had not resolved, and the Wizengamot date would be set within a fortnight. In the office upstairs, Dumbledore sat for a long time. He thought about the young Auror, 21, newly qualified, who had gone to a house in Surrey with a standard welfare form on bureaucratic obligation, and had written, in her own handwriting on the back of a ministry document, what 13 years of careful reasoning had produced. He was not angry. When he examined the available emotions, there was no anger. What was there instead was something more precise and less comfortable. He was ashamed. Not of her, not of the report or the petition. He was ashamed of the fact that she had been able to do this, that it had been available to do for 13 years, and no one had done it. He sat with that for some time. The ministry corridor where Tonks waited was the kind of corridor that exists in the lower floors of government buildings and serves no purpose except transit. It had portraits, former ministers, a woman he didn't recognize in Edwardian robes, a man who appeared to be asleep. It had a clock on the far wall that ticked with the particular rhythm of a clock that has been keeping time in an empty room for decades and has lost any sense of occasion. She had her confirmation that Sirius Black's appearance before the Wizengamot had been formally scheduled. She was waiting for the paperwork to be signed by the relevant office, because that was how things were done, and she sat in a chair against the wall and waited for the paperwork. She thought about her mother. She thought about the black family tapestry at Grimmauld Place and the burn hole where Andromeda should have been, the specific shape of an erasure, oval, darkened at the edges the way things are when they have been removed by force. Her mother had married Ted Tonks, and they had burned her off the tree because she had chosen someone the family considered unacceptable and refused to unchoose him. A burn hole was the shape of a choice. She looked at the sleeping portrait and the ticking clock and thought about what she had done. The welfare report, the petition, the invocation of house rights that could not be withdrawn, the machinery she had set in motion by paying attention to a child in a garden in Surrey. And she thought about whether it was that kind, whether it was a choice she had made with open eyes and would not unmake. The paperwork arrived. She signed it. She put it in her bag and stood up and walked out of the corridor, and the clock continued to tick behind her into the empty air. He had to go to Grimmauld Place first, which was its own kind of horror. Creature was in the hall. The house smelled of old magic and old cloth. Sirius went to the room with the wardrobe, found what he needed, and left. The longer he was in Grimmauld Place, the stronger the pull of it became, and he could not afford to be pulled anywhere except forward. The formal robes of the most ancient and noble house of Black were black, as everything of the house tended to be, with silver at the collar and cuffs in patterns that were older than the ministry they were going to enter. He had not worn them since before Azkaban. They fit differently now. He had been broader once, before 12 years of whatever Azkaban did to a person's body. But they were close enough, and more important than fit was what they communicated. He was not presenting himself as a fugitive. He was presenting himself as the lord of his house, exercising a house's right to appear before the Wizengamot. The distinction mattered legally. He had been advised of this by someone who knew what they were doing. He was going to make the distinction count. He walked into the Ministry of Magic through the visitor entrance or on a morning in late August. He was gaunt and hollow-cheeked, and his hair was long, and none of that could be helped. What could be helped was his posture, and his expression, and the formal robes. He stood up straight. He stated his name and his title. He surrendered his wand. The Aurors on either side of him were professionally courteous and professionally alert, and they took him to a ministry holding chamber with proper furniture and a window, and the particular quality of a room that was designed to be confinement without being punitive. And he sat in it for 2 days. Dumbledore came on the second day. He looked much as Sirius remembered. The half-moon spectacles, the long silver beard, the particular quality of enormous old intelligence that had been considering things longer than Sirius had been alive. He sat down across from Sirius, and they looked at each other for a moment. "I know you don't think this will go cleanly," Sirius said. "No," said Dumbledore. "The political situation is complicated, and Cornelius Fudge is not without influence on the Wizengamot's composition." "I know." Sirius looked at his hands. They were thinner than he remembered his hands being. "But it's the truth, all of it. And they'll have me under veritaserum." "Yes." "So." He looked up. "Either they believe the truth when they hear it, or they don't. And if they don't, then we are in a different kind of trouble than anything I can solve by staying in a cave." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "I hope I'm wrong," he said, "about how cleanly it will go." It was not a reassurance. It was something more honest than a reassurance, which was what Sirius had always found he could get from Dumbledore when he got anything. They brought him to the Wizengamot chamber 3 days after his arrival, when the veritaserum had been confirmed from the ministry stores and the proceedings formally convened. The chamber was below the atrium, and it had the quality of all rooms that had held a great deal of weight over centuries. Stone walls, high ceiling, the Wizengamot members in their plum-coloured robes, with the silver W embroidered on the chest arranged in tiers around the central space where he sat, and the room was cold in the way of rooms that are cold because of what happens in them. They administered 3 drops of veritaserum. He felt it work the way he had been told it worked, not as compulsion, exactly, more as the removal of the option of being anything other than accurate. He could still choose what to say. He simply could not choose to say something false. He told them about Peter Pettigrew. Peter Pettigrew was alive. He had been alive since 1981, living in animagus form as a rat. He was an unregistered animagus. He had been the Potter's secret keeper, not Sirius, because they had changed the plan at the last moment on Sirius's suggestion, believing Sirius to be the more obvious target, and Peter the safer choice. This had been the worst decision of Sirius's life, and he had known it for 12 years in Azkaban. Peter Pettigrew had killed 12 muggles with a single curse, cut off his own finger, transformed into a rat, and let the world conclude that Sirius had killed him. Sirius gave the date and the street. He gave the names of the muggles who had died, because he had found them out in prison, because knowing them had been the only act of witness he could perform. He was consistent. He did not waver. Under veritaserum, there was only the truth laid out in the correct order. He told them about the night James and Lily Potter died, where he had been, what he had done, when he had arrived at Godric's Hollow. He described what he had found. The broken door, the smell of the curse still in the air, James Potter in the hallway, and in the crib upstairs the living baby who was James's son. And, in every way that had ever mattered to Sirius, his responsibility. Lupin testified as a supporting witness on oath, not under veritaserum, which the hearing format did not require for witnesses. His account was consistent with Sirius's at every point. 2 members of the Wizengamot challenged the weight of his testimony on the grounds of his werewolf status, and their objections were noted, and Dumbledore then gave his own testimony. Dumbledore testified that he had assisted Sirius's escape from Azkaban in June of the previous year because of what had been witnessed in the Shrieking Shack by Harry Potter, Hermione Granger, and Remus Lupin, that Peter Pettigrew had been alive, had been the potter's secret keeper and had escaped before he could be brought before the ministry. He said this as chief warlock of the Wizengamot, testifying before his own body, and the weight of his position was not a thing that could be contested by anyone in that chamber with a question about werewolves. The Wizengamot noted that Peter Pettigrew was currently unaccounted for and opened a formal fugitive case. His whereabouts would not be established. He was already gone, already further away than any ministry search would reach. But the case was opened, which meant his name was now officially before the same legal apparatus that had held Sirius's. When the examination was complete, Sirius stood. He stood up in the cold Wizengamot chamber, and he invoked, formally, by the precise language that house protocols required, and that he had memorized from the relevant legal documents in Grimmauld Place, the rights of the most ancient and noble house of Black before the body that had always been required to recognize them. He stated his name and his title and the house's hereditary seat. He stated that he was claiming guardianship of Harry James Potter under the Godfather Covenant that had been established when James Potter, before credible witnesses, had designated him as Harry's guardian in the event of James's death or incapacitation. The covenant, he said, had not been rescinded. It had simply been made unreachable by an imprisonment that had been, as the Wizengamot had now established, unlawful. He was here to reach it. He said this with the formal robes on, and the silver at his collar, and the gaunt face that Azkaban had given him and James's son's name in his mouth, and the Wizengamot took the claim under formal consideration. Outside the chamber, in the corridor with the low ministry lighting and the government portraits that watched proceedings with the patience of paint, Tonks stood waiting. She had been on the outside of the door for 5 hours, by official rotation of Aurors assigned to the proceeding. She had heard the murmur of testimony through the stone, could not make out words, only the rhythm of question and answer. She had heard the particular quality of a room that has arrived at something. When the session ended, the doors opened, and there was movement. And then Sirius Black was in the corridor. He was taller than she had expected. She had looked at files and the photographs in the files, which showed someone diminished, and the man in front of her was diminished in the same ways, the gauntness, the years on his face. But he was also, underneath the diminishment, someone who had been other things before, and those other things were still in his frame. He looked at her. She was in her Auror robes. Her hair was pink because she had not changed it. "You're Andromeda's daughter," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment with grey eyes that were tired and clear and, she thought, more present than she had expected them to be. "She raised you well," he said. Then the Aurors on either side of him moved forward, and he was walked past her down the corridor, not in chains, not to Azkaban, but not yet free. And the chapter closed on the sound of his footsteps retreating down the stone floor of the Ministry of Magic, and the ruling still to come. Ted had given him a book. It was a paperback, slightly worn at the spine, the kind of book Ted kept in stacks around the sitting room without particular organization. Harry had accepted it with genuine intention to read it, and had been holding it, closed, on the kitchen table for 3 hours. He knew the shape of waiting for news. He had waited in corridors outside hospital wings, not knowing, counting tiles. He had waited in a cupboard under the stairs, listening to footsteps overhead, not knowing what kind of mood was above him. He had waited in the dark in more configurations than he could fully enumerate, alone, cataloguing possible outcomes with the specific efficiency of someone who has learned that hoping for particular things is less useful than being prepared for several things. This was different. He was at a kitchen table in a warm house, and Ted was doing something in the sitting room that involved the occasional quiet sound of a radio turned very low, and Andromeda was writing at the other end of the table with the focused composure of someone who has decided to be occupied. And the kitchen was the kitchen. Harry sat with the book and looked at the cover and did not read any of it. He had been told that Sirius went to the ministry. He had not been told what was happening in the chamber. He understood why. There was no point knowing anything until there was something to know. And he understood this in his head and in his stomach. It didn't make any difference. He turned the book over. He turned it back. The front door opened at 4:15. He heard it before she came through to the kitchen. The specific sound of Tonks's particular approach to doors, which was not careless so much as it was efficient, more force than necessary at the hinge. Then she was in the kitchen doorway in her Auror robes and her pink hair, and she looked at all of them, and she sat down. Nobody said anything. Andromeda had put down her quill. Ted had appeared in the doorway from the sitting room. "He's exonerated," Tonks said. She said it to the table, or to all of them equally, and then she looked up and said it again, as though she needed to say it twice to confirm it to herself. The Wizengamot vacated the conviction. He never had a trial. The conviction was entered without one, and they could not maintain it against Veritaserum testimony and Dumbledore's corroboration. It's vacated. He's free. Andromeda said something short. It was not in English, or it was in English, and the emotion in it made it something else, something fierce and barely contained, and Ted crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her without saying anything, and she let him, and did not say anything else. Harry sat at the kitchen table. He sat there for a long time. Tonks was watching him, and he knew she was watching him, and he did not look at her. He was looking at the cover of Ted's book, which he had still not read, and he was doing something that was not thinking exactly, and was not feeling exactly, but was the thing that happens in the space before either. "He can actually," he started. He stopped. He tried again. "He's free? Like, actually free?" "Actually free," Tonks said. "Cleared. The record amended. Pettigrew formally listed as a fugitive." She paused. "It's done." Harry put his face in his hands. He did not cry, quite. He came close. He sat there with his face in his hands, and he was very still for a long time, and no one said anything, and the kitchen stayed warm around him, and he sat in it. What Sirius Black had won was not only his freedom. He was, now formally, and without legal obstruction, the lord of the most ancient and noble house of Black. He had always been this, technically, since Walburga Black died in 1985, and the estate descended. But a lord in Azkaban cannot exercise lordship, and a fugitive cannot enforce ancient rights, and the title had existed in a legal suspension that ended today. The Wizengamot's ruling had not only cleared his name, it had returned him to himself. The house. 12 Grimmauld Place, London, a townhouse that had been in the Black family for generations, and had never not been in the Black family, because the Black family did not permit things to leave it. It was in a state of dark, decaying grandeur, maintained by habit and old magic, and one house elf with complicated feelings about his circumstances. The elf, Creature, bound to Grimmauld Place and to the Black family by magic that did not care what year it was, or who was free and who was imprisoned. He was Sirius's now, by title, by legal fact, by whatever unhappy arrangement that would produce. The title, the hereditary Wizengamot seat. The Gringotts' vault that had been accumulating interest for years in the absence of anyone with the legal standing to access it. The family library, the heirlooms, the standing, and the legal standing to be Harry Potter's guardian, which Sirius had claimed formally before the Wizengamot not 3 hours ago, and which was now a matter of official record. And Harry, The narrator named each of these things carefully. This was the title of the story made literal. The full weight of House Black, landing all at once on one very thin man who had spent the last year in a cave. Tonks went outside. She sat on the front step of her mother's house, with her Auror robe still on, and the evening air coming in, and she realized she had not eaten since this morning. She had not thought about it until now, which was apparently what adrenaline did to a person's awareness of their own basic requirements. She had come to the Ministry of Magic 11 weeks ago with a welfare form and a routine assignment, the most junior Auror available, dispatched because junior Aurors get the routine things, and she had written on the back of a ministry document in her own handwriting what she actually found, and filed it, and invoked a legal right she had technically possessed her entire life and had never thought about, and the result of all of this was Sirius Black, age 34, formerly of Azkaban, currently the lord of the most ancient and noble house of Black, exonerated free approximately 40 minutes from arriving at this house to meet his godson for the first time as a free man. She thought about her senior training officer. He was not a person who gave compliments freely, and he had been, she understood, concerned about the report. But she thought about what he would say when she filed the final welfare case closure. She thought he might actually be proud. He came in the evening, at an hour when the light was low and the kitchen was warm. He knocked, because it was someone else's house, because he was learning, Tonks thought, to do things in the right order. And Ted answered, and brought him through to the kitchen. Harry was still at the table. Sirius stopped in the doorway. Harry looked up. They looked at each other in the lit kitchen of the Tonks house, with ordinary furniture around them, and ordinary people present, and the specific quality of two people who have never been in the same room under normal circumstances, who have all their history in corridors and emergencies and darkness, and who do not have a template for what this is. Sirius was still gaunt. He had washed, and someone had found him a set of robes that were not formal, house black, and were not cave dirty, and he was taller than the photograph in the file, and the gauntness was real and present, and the grey in his dark hair was real, and he was standing in a kitchen doorway, looking at Harry with the expression of someone who has wanted something for so long that when it arrives, he does not immediately know how to inhabit the moment. He crossed the room. He put a hand on Harry's shoulder. Solid, present, the hand of someone who had kept a promise through 12 years of Azkaban and a year in hiding, arriving here. "I'm sorry it took so long," Sirius said. Harry looked at him. 14 years old, thin, round glasses, lightning bolt scar, green eyes that were very bright in the kitchen light. "You came," Harry said. "That's enough." The narrator did not editorialize this. It did not need to. Andromeda made a meal. It was not ceremonial. It was a real meal with the things that were available and no particular presentation. And Sirius sat at the table and ate it. He ate slowly. He ate with his whole attention on the food in front of him, which was the attention of someone for whom a real meal at a table with people was something that required noticing. He ate all of it. No one talked. The kitchen was warm, and the evening went dark outside the window, and the people around the table were quiet in the way of people who have all been through something and have arrived together at the other side of it. This was enough. It was enough for now, and now was what they had, and Sirius Black ate his meal, and the chapter ended. The house at Grimmauld Place was dark, high-ceilinged, smelling of old magic and older cloth, and aggressively committed to its own atmosphere. The gas lamps gave off a light that was more hostile than illuminating. There were mounted heads on the wall of the staircase landing, and a row of house elf heads beneath them, and Harry stood in the entrance hall and looked at the house elf heads, and looked at Sirius. "Black family," Sirius said. "We'll deal with it." Creature appeared without warning, in the manner of house elves that have had decades to practice, materializing from shadow. He was small and ancient, and wearing what appeared to be a loincloth fashioned from an old pillowcase, and he looked at Sirius with an expression that communicated deep and specific resentment, while remaining technically within the bounds of compliant greeting. "Master has returned to the house of his ancestors," Creature said, in a voice that managed to make every word sound like a small formal accusation. "Creature," Sirius said, with the tone of a man managing a great deal. Creature then looked at Harry. He looked at him for a long moment, with red-rimmed, watery eyes. He said nothing. He turned and shuffled away down the corridor without any further communication, which Harry thought might actually be worse than something explicit. "Hello," Harry said, to the empty corridor. The corridor did not respond. He followed Sirius up the stairs to the first floor, and the tapestry that covered the better part of one wall from floor to ceiling. It was ancient and clearly hand-worked, the kind of thing that had taken someone a very long time, and it showed a family tree in gold-embroidered thread going back centuries. Names and dates and connecting lines, and, distributed throughout, the scorched oval marks where names had been. Sirius stopped in front of it and looked at it for a moment with the expression of someone revisiting a thing they have spent considerable time not revisiting. He pointed to a burn hole in the middle of the lower section, an oval of darkened wallpaper where thread had been. "That was me. They burned me off when I was 16 because I ran away and went to live with the Potters and told the family where they could put their pure-blood supremacy." Harry looked at the burn hole. "And this one, another, close to his own. Andromeda. She married Ted, who is Muggle-born, and they burned her off for it." He lowered his hand. "My mother found it very satisfying, removing people from things." Harry looked at the two adjacent holes. He looked at the names around them, the ones still there, embroidered in careful gold, and he thought about how many people this family had decided were not worth keeping. He thought about the family tree at Privet Drive, which was a concept that had never applied to him, and to which he had never been added. He did not say any of this. He kept it, the way he kept things that were too complicated for the available language. "Right," Sirius said. "Let's clean." Walburga Black's portrait was in the entrance hall on the ground floor, hidden behind a velvet curtain that had been moth-eaten but was still structurally present. Sirius approached it with a broom and the specific expression of someone about to do something they have been dreading, and when the curtain moved by accident, the portrait woke and began screaming, and the screaming was impressive in scope and volume. Filth, impurity, the shame of traitor blood, and Sirius managed to get the curtain back in place and stood with his hand against it until the screaming stopped. "Can't remove it," he said. "Sticking charm. Permanent. We cover it and we don't touch it and we live with it." Harry said, "Right," and picked up the broom. They worked through the afternoon. Sitting room first, dragging furniture, covering the worst trophies with sheets. A study with shelves of books that Sirius did not throw out, because they were a library, even if they were a library with beliefs. A bathroom that had not been properly cleaned since approximately 1970. Harry worked beside him, efficiently and without complaint. He carried things, he scrubbed things, he shifted furniture. He did not stop when Sirius stopped, and he did not slow down when the task seemed trivial. And he had the quality of someone who has been useful in a practical sense for so long that usefulness has become invisible to him. At one point in the middle of the bathroom, Sirius said, "You don't have to work like this, you know." Harry looked up. "I know." He kept working. Sirius did not push it. Lupin arrived in the late afternoon with groceries and the certainty of a man who has decided tea is the correct response to most situations. He and Sirius stood in the kitchen for a moment, the kind of moment that contains a great deal of freight without requiring any expression. And then Lupin put the groceries on the counter and said, "Kettle?" And Sirius said, "Yes." And they made tea. Everything that had happened since the Shrieking Shack was present between them without being named, and they were still standing, which was the thing that mattered. Tonks appeared approximately an hour after Lupin, tripped over the front doorstep in the way she tripped over most things, with commitment and full presence, and swore audibly, and the sound carried to the kitchen where Harry was sitting with his tea. He almost laughed. The almost laugh escaped this time, more fully than the last one had, and Sirius heard it from across the kitchen, and something in his face changed for the better. Andromeda and Ted came in the evening. Andromeda had not been in this house since the year her name was burned off the tapestry. She stood in the entrance hall and looked at it quietly, the way she looked at most things, directly, without performance. She walked through the front hall slowly. She paused at the tapestry and looked at the burn hole for a long moment, her own oval of absence in the embroidered family tree, and then she walked to the kitchen. She began cleaning it. She found cleaning things under the sink, which had the resigned quality of cleaning things that have been under that sink for 20 years, and she began to clean the kitchen with the specific focused energy of someone who needs something to do with their hands, and Harry was already there. And so they worked. He had cooked his whole life. He had done it at Privet Drive from the age of 7, learning the stove, the timings, what was preferred, doing it the way anything is done when it is extracted from you as service rather than offered as care. He did not think about this now. He thought about what was available and what could be made of it. And he made something. What was different was the people he was making it for. He made supper for all of them, and when they sat at the table and ate it, no one said thank you the way you say thank you to someone performing a function. They said it the way you say it when someone has done something for you. The distinction was not large, viewed from outside. From inside, it was the size of everything. Dumbledore's letter arrived after dinner. Sirius read it and passed it to Harry. It confirmed that Lily's blood protection was void. It stated that he would begin work on alternative protective measures. It was written in the register of someone who has decided to put only the facts in writing, and it closed with something that was not quite an apology, and was not quite not one. Harry folded it. He thought about the cupboard with his name on the inside of the door, and all the summers that had kept him alive by mechanisms he had known nothing about. He thought about the people at this table. He did not think that what he had now was less protection. He thought it was different protection, and that different, in this case, was not worse. Sirius was asleep in an armchair by 9 o'clock, in the way of a man who has been running on something other than adequate rest for over a year, and has finally, cautiously, put enough of the running down to sleep. The fire in the grate was low. The house breathed around them in its old, hostile way, but the kitchen was warm from the cooking and the people in it. Harry stood at the window of the sitting room and looked out at the London night sky. Street lamps, the odd lit window of the house across the street, a city that was entirely ordinary and did not know anything about any of this. He was going back to Hogwarts in 2 weeks from here. He had not had anywhere to go back from before. Harry woke in the spare room at Grimmauld Place and lay still for a moment in the dark. The room smelled of old books and something faintly chemical that was probably the cleaning. The ceiling was high and the light coming under the curtain was grey and early and London. He lay there until he remembered. Then he remembered. Today. He was going back to Hogwarts today. From here. The kitchen smelled of smoke when he got downstairs, which was informative. Sirius was at the stove with the focused expression of a man approaching an unfamiliar and potentially hostile piece of equipment. He had the quality of someone who has been in a cave for a year and has only recently discovered that having a functional kitchen and knowing how to use one are not the same thing. "Eggs," Sirius said, without turning around. "Right," said Harry. The eggs, when they arrived, were ambitious rather than successful. The toast was burned on one side and pale on the other. Sirius put the plate down and looked at it and said, "I'm aware of the situation." "They're fine," Harry said. He ate the eggs. They were fine. He ate the toast. He drank the tea, which Sirius had made correctly. Tea being one of those things that even 12 years in Azkaban could not remove from a person's competence. He sat at the kitchen table in the house that was his godfather's and ate the breakfast that his godfather had made and did not say anything more about the eggs. Sirius sat across from him with his own tea and the slightly uncertain quality of a man who is learning, for the first time in a very long time, how to be in an ordinary morning. Hedwig watched from her perch on the counter, with the alert, opinionated expression of a snowy owl who has made her assessment of the eggs known to no one, but has clearly made it. His school robes were new, and they fit. This was a thing Harry was aware of, in the way you are aware of things that have always been different, and are now, quietly, correct. He had always had school robes. The school made provisions, but they had been second-hand and sized for someone else. Sirius had spent 3 weeks with the Black family vault, and a list that Harry had been asked to approve, and the robes were new, and the trunk had his name on it properly, and the things in it were his. His wand was his, the holly and phoenix feather wand that was 11 inches, and supple and had always been his, from the beginning. Hedwig was his. He had things that were his. The narrator noted this once, and did not return to it. They went to King's Cross 4, Sirius and Harry and Lupin and Tonks, Sirius in robes rather than cave-appropriate clothing, looking gaunt and improving and slightly startled by the reality of a London September morning, all the muggle commuters, and the noise and the ordinary energy of a city that did not know anything about any of them. Lupin beside him, with the steady air of someone keeping a gentle hand on things. Tonks ahead, navigating the station with the confident purpose of someone who has been through King's Cross a great many times, and whose hair was precisely as pink as it always was. The barrier was the unremarkable stretch of brick between platforms 9 and 10. Harry went through it and was on the other side in the steam, and the Scarlet, and the particular early September crowd, and the Hogwarts Express alongside platform 9 3/4 in the way it always sat there, enormous and real and going north. People on the platform recognized Sirius. Harry noticed it happening. A woman in robes turned with her 2 children and stared, and the children stared, and then a man further along the platform turned and looked, and the effect rippled outward. A year ago, less than a year ago, the staring had meant something specific and frightening. It had meant wanted, dangerous, escaped. Now the Daily Prophet had run the story twice, and the Wizengamot ruling had been issued, and the staring was different. It was the staring of people looking at a man they have held a wrong belief about, and who are, in real time, revising it. Sirius noticed the staring. He had been stared at in different ways across 40 years of his life. For his name, for his beauty, for his arrest, for his escape. And he had learned, at some point prior to Azkaban, how to stand in it. He stood with Harry and did not flinch, and Harry watched him not flinch, and found, to his own mild surprise, that it was steadying. He found Ron and Hermione's compartment and loaded his trunk and said he'd be back and came to the window. Sirius was on the platform. He was easy to find in the crowd. The dark hair, the height, the gauntness that was still present, but was acquiring, week by week, some of the substance it had lost over years in a cell and a year in a cave. He was standing in the September morning, and he was looking at the train, and when he found Harry in the window, he raised his hand. Harry raised his hand back. The whistle blew. The train began to move, and Sirius walked with the window, the specific walk of a person keeping pace with something that is leaving. And then he was not walking any more. He was standing still and waving with his whole arm. And Harry watched from the window as the platform receded, and the station gave way to the city, and the city to the outskirts, and the train went north in the grey September morning light. He stayed at the window until there was nothing left to see. That, the narrator said, is what a person looks like when they choose to stay. He turned and went back to find Ron and Hermione. Tonks watched the train until the red tail of the Hogwarts Express disappeared into the grey distance, and then she stood on the emptying platform and didn't move immediately. Beside her, Sirius lowered his arm. Lupin had his hands in his pockets, looking in the direction the train had gone, with the tranquil expression of someone who has learned to look at departures and see returns. "That's it, then," Tonks said. "That's it," said Sirius. She turned to go. The trolley had been left by a pillar approximately 4 feet from where she was standing, and she walked into it at a reasonable pace and with full commitment, and it hit the pillar with a sound that was informative about the solidity of both, and she swore, the specific kind of swear that is entirely involuntary, direct from the nervous system, without any editorial process intervening. Sirius laughed. He laughed the way someone laughs who has forgotten, temporarily, that laughter was a thing they were permitted. Not carefully, not guardedly, not as a controlled quantity. Just laughed, because a competent junior Auror, who had spent 11 weeks outmaneuvering the Ministry of Magic, had walked into a trolley, and it was the funniest thing he had seen in a very long time. And he was not in a cave, and he was not in Azkaban, and laughing was allowed now, and apparently his body had remembered that. Lupin looked startled. Then he was laughing too. Tonks turned to face them both, with her hand pressed to her shin, and the expression of someone who is a professional and is surrounded by people who are not treating her professionally. She gestured at them, a comprehensive, bilateral gesture, indicating that they should stop immediately. Her hair, which had not changed colour since September the 1st at approximately 7 in the morning, cycled briefly through 3 shades of orange before settling back on pink. She was also laughing. She was laughing while gesturing at them to stop, and Sirius was laughing at her, gesturing at them to stop, and Lupin had his hand over his mouth in a way that was not concealing anything, and the platform was almost empty around them, and the train was going north